Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. We have a marvelous guest for you today in honor of our veterans who are fighting and defending for our country overseas in what seems to be a never-ending war in Iraq. Today we're going to share an interesting story about a particular class of West Point graduates, considered the bicentennial class of 2002, who had no idea that in a time of peace that would be the very thing that they would be facing. Because as you know, on September 11, 2001, we had a terrorist attack here on American soil. And it was in 2002, as this graduating class was about to get their rings and move on into their careers, that George Bush announced we would take the war to the enemy, And today, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is author of a new book, In a Time of War. Our guest today is Bill Murphy, who worked with Bob Woodward's research assistants on the best-selling State of Denial, and he's also a lawyer and former Army Reserve officer. He reported from Iraq for the Washington Post in 2007. And he's here to talk about this wonderful class and what their duty was for our country, and the book simply In a Time of War. And Bill Murphy, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Oh, Daniel, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, this is an interesting book because you start out by profiling particular cadets, and then you pretty much follow where they came from, what their story was about getting into West Point to serve, and then it just kind of continues on into the war. So how did you decide which particular people that you wanted to, I guess, profile in this book, In a Time of War?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that was hard. I mean, there are 958 people in this class, 958 really compelling stories, and what I did was I reached out to as many of them as I possibly could. I mean, into the hundreds. I did 600 interviews total for this book. And I started to track some of them. And most of the ones I was following, they were the ones that their peers had said, well, this is an interesting guy. This woman's really impressive. You know, you should keep an eye on them. And so I had a couple of dozen that I was really following pretty closely for, the better part of more than 2.5 years. And, part of how one thing I wanted to do was try and pick people that would tell a larger story, whose experiences would be somewhat statistically valid, for lack of a better term, to compare to how the class was as a whole. So, for example, 90% of this class went to Iraq. More than half of them went 2 or even 3 times. So I wanted that to be reflected in the soldiers that I was writing about. There were some places where that, the story kind of leads you to it. And I wound up writing mainly about 2 groups of friends. They were 2 groups of people who were in separate companies at West Point. It's a military academy, so they were assigned to companies, military formations as they go through. And after 4 years, they became very, very close. So in a lot of ways, the story is about friends. It's about people. It's about showing that these officers are real people that are, very much like we civilians on the outside. And over time, I guess, their stories became so compelling, and the book, in a way, sort of guided me to who I should focus on.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got to tell you that, as I read through the book, and I encourage the listeners to do this because, it's easy to take a stance on the war in Iraq this day and age to say it's drawn out, it's time to pull the troops out, but everybody keeps saying, well, you need to honor the troops, we need to support the troops, but what is missing in those comments is the real humanity, as you bring out so eloquently in the book, about the real people who are over there, to realize that these are people who have dreams, they have ambitions, and it seemed that there's something about West Point that creates the need for marriage, as I noticed in your book. And it was really neat because it reads, to me, it was almost like watching an officer and a gentleman in the very beginning. But then you realize that anybody who served in the military, some of the military bureaucratic BS, if you will, toward kind of skewering some of their dreams. And so you really touched on the reality of what it was like to possibly go to West Point, the difficulties of that, to have a dream in the military, which can be skewered because of their own agendas, but then actually to be in the war as well. Now, first talk a little bit about what West Point is and what it takes for a person to get in there.
Yeah, well, West Point is it's a 4-year military academy. It's owned by and run by the United States government. A significant number of the professors there and the dean and the superintendent are all active duty military officers, and I'm actually right near West Point right now as we speak. It's about an hour and a half north of New York City. It's a little bit isolated in a lot of ways, though. It's so close to New York City, but it's really it's sort of an oasis away from the civilian world when you go on campus there and you go through the checkpoints and you see these cadets walking around in uniform. But it's a very, very competitive school. It's on a par, pretty close to, if not surpassing, how competitive our best Ivy League and large state institutions are. A lot of the kids, and they are kids when they get there anyway, could have gone to Harvard or Yale, and they chose, kind of Harvard and Yale with more push-ups and discipline. In exchange, there's no tuition at West Point, same as at the Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy and the Coast Guard Academy. But where they do get you is on the other end, where you owe 8 years service, and normally that's 5 years active duty and 3 in the reserves.
I know in your book you say one of the cadets had mentioned that you actually pay the tuition, but it's a nickel at a time shoved in, well, where he says you shove it, actually.
Yeah. For radio we'll say up your nose, and we'll just
up your nose. There you go. That'll be good. We'll pick a different orifice anyway. Now, what I really enjoy, about this book again, is it brings the humanity to the people serving, because a lot of times as the war is reported, all you see is a running tally and maybe a special interest story. But here, you've captured a group of people almost suspended in time. Now, let me understand, was this the first time that a graduating class of West Point were actually called into war, or has this happened before?
Well, I think it's the first time in a generation. Certainly every class during the Vietnam era, they knew when they graduated that their path went through Vietnam and in World War II, but this is the first time since Vietnam. And what's interesting, there are many interesting things, but one is what their perception of what war would be when they graduated, because, of course, their frame of reference, these are all young kids born in 1979, 1980, their frame of reference for a war was something like the Gulf War, Panama, Grenada, that's over very quickly from the United States perspective. I guarantee you there are very few who in 2002 when they graduated thought the country would still be at war in 2008. But it was unique. President Bush was at that graduation and gave this speech in which he outlined the Bush Doctrine, which ironically is sort of how I came to the book to begin with, how I focused on their stories. The presidents do give speeches every year at one of the military academies, but this is one of the more significant ones that was ever given there. Bush's speechwriters at the time, I think, looked at this speech as being equivalent to Winston Churchill and his Iron Curtain speech down in Missouri, and it just struck me, wow, he chose to give it to the new cadets who'd actually be carrying out the brand new foreign policy he'd come up with.
Now, Bill, as you were actually doing the research, as you were talking with the individuals that you feature in book In a Time of War, did you see any transformations that changed to a point to where, as they faced and were in the reality of what war was, that it was no longer something you've seen in a television movie such as Pearl Harbor, or a video game that you may play? Did you see these young men and women, just their attitudes about everything change about being in the military, or do they remain true and to spec, as West Point turns out fantastic Army officers, to where they still felt that duty and the honor, and you still have to do what needs to be done?
Yeah, what's funny is I'd answer that question by saying both, and often both in the same person. I look at some of the photographs of these people some of them right when they graduated, and they look so young, and then 5 years go by, and I look at the pictures, and they look 15 years older in some cases. They matured, as any of us does, over a 5-year period, but boy, do they cram a lot into those 5 years, and a lot of experience, more than, maybe than the fortunate among us will ever have to cram into our lifetimes in some cases. At the beginning, I think most of them were fairly eager to be involved in the war, because that's where we were as a country then. Everybody wanted to participate, and they'd just gone through 4 years of learning how to do this, learning the basics of being a military officer, and they, like any profession, when you train for it, you want to do it. But, of course, they also went to Iraq again and again and again, and that's going to take its toll on even the most motivated, gung-ho soldier.
Right. And what were some of
but the other side of that, I would say...
ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was
just going to say the other side of it is that...
Yeah.
We'll have to do like the military. We'll say over at the end of each sentence. I just wanted to point out the other side of it, that you asked if they were still proud of it, if they still felt like they need to do what needs to be done, and I'd say absolutely. I can't think of anyone who said he regretted having chosen this path. That said, a lot of them are getting out, as always happens, and in many cases it's because they say, I've done 3 tours, I've done my duty, and I'm at the limits personally, emotionally, in terms of my family, of how much I can carry for my country right now.
Yeah, again, it's always compelling to know that you have the idea of what war is, and then when you engage in a military process of being involved in a war, that you find that it's a lot different than you thought it was, and sometimes there are things you see and you think, what brought me to this point? What was I thinking? But you realize that it's through the commitment that you make, through your patriotism of your country, that it kind of pushes you through. But how have they been holding up, and have you been in touch with the people that you profiled in your book lately?
Yeah, no, I'm really fortunate because, we spent so much time. I spent so much time with some of these people that I think, especially now that the book is out and we can sort of let our guard down a little bit more even, I'm fortunate to consider many of them friends. And, I've had an opportunity to, just earlier this week, I was up in Boston for some things related to the book, and was able to hang around with a really great guy in the book named Drew Sloan, who got out of the Army after 2 tours, and he's now at the Harvard Business School. I enjoyed kind of teasing him because he's dressed a lot more stylishly and has much longer hair than I do now, and I'm supposed to be the shaggy-haired reporter,
And do you still call him Andy, or?
Yeah, no, he goes by Drew. He's, he's actually out entirely. He was wounded in Afghanistan, but recovered to serve in Iraq. But at this point, he's out of the Army entirely. So he's former Captain Sloan, but he goes by Drew. And then some of the sadder stories, frankly, where people that didn't survive the war, unfortunately, but I'm still in touch with their families. As I say, I'm at West Point right now, and I'm going to be going to a football game this weekend with the families of one soldier who unfortunately didn't come home. And I talked to others, and I really do. I was blessed to write a book where these people were so compelling, but they also were compelling on a personal level to me, and I got to the point where I just like them.
Yeah, I know.
So
when you talk about Drew Sloan, it was interesting because he had left Arkansas and he was actually sort of distancing himself from his family in many ways, kind of one of those renegades. And his story was pretty compelling because this was a kid that really you didn't think would amount to much, and he just kind of grew in to West Point to the point where they could see a real natural, raw leadership ability in a person like that.
Yeah, we have that story a few times here. We've got, Drew's a smart man and had done well in school, but I think he found purpose in the military. And I think I always joke with him, once you get past the fact that you were hit with an RPG, a rocket-propelled grenade, and spent a year recovering and having his face stitched up, once you get past that minor inconvenience, right, he's a very fortunate man who just had time to had the opportunity to reflect and to have a much deeper appreciation for what he values in life and what he'd done. And then there are others who, were not students who, there's a program at West Point for enlisted soldiers who maybe didn't do that well in high school, but they show promise once they're in the Army and they can go to West Point. And there's one guy in particular who, it was almost a joke when he told me about how low his SAT scores were when he first applied to West Point, but he's a guy who turned out to be just a phenomenal combat officer, a guy who knew what he was doing and led his troops. And for me, he passed what I think is my test in writing this book, which is, would I want my kid brother to have him as a leader in the Army? And just with flying colors, absolutely yes.
Now, Bill, let me ask you, as you were talking with these folks, what was their perceptions about the war, and what did they share with you, especially when you were also talking with the families who had maybe their son or their daughter lost in this war? Yeah.
Well, that's hard, obviously. It's but I think one of the benefits for the way that I did this book and that they were just so wonderful with me is that I was able to talk with them again and again and again and again over many years, and I saw the rhythms. I mean, this book, really covers more than 5 years, and I saw their perceptions change. And I also appreciated definitely that it's hard to, with one brush, characterize how they feel about the war, or really at any point. There's, those who lost loved ones. I think they very much want to see some good come out of this in the end. But they're also clear-eyed enough that at times when they didn't think it was going well, they'd sometimes say, we don't want more people to have to make a sacrifice in order to honor our sacrifice. But it was interesting to me because I saw the rhythms, and I saw, sort of gung-ho attitude early on in the war, and I saw discouragement at the darkest hours that we've had in Iraq. But I have to say, more recently, and some of them are getting out of the Army now, but more recently I saw more encouragement and more, a feeling that we've gone through and sacrificed so much that if we have a potential for a successful outcome, which I do think we have in Iraq now, that they didn't want to see us pull up our tent stakes and leave.
Yeah, I think the reason for asking the question isn't so much to take a position on it, but that we want our listening audience to understand that there are true casualties of war even in the living sometimes, and we have done programs for veterans, for instance, and one particular is a psychologist who's worked for more than 30 years in the field of helping veterans to rehabilitate, and has a marvelous book out called War on the Soul. And, we're in a new time that it isn't seemingly like we go to war for the ideal of defending our country. It seems that way anyway. Vietnam was an unpopular war, and this one's kind of moving to a point where we're starting to question and wonder, but that's from the civilian side. What we still need to understand is that we have men and women that are over there that chose to do this, and they're going to come back, and the last thing they need to hear and understand is, that was ridiculous. It's like, but I was there, I had to do this, at least be honored at least and not cast aside and to be forgotten, to say the least. And that's what we really try to share with the listening audience is, when they come back, they're expecting to be nurtured and loved and respected for the most part because of what they've had to put themselves through, regardless of the reasons of why we were there.
Yeah, I think well, it's great that you do that, and you hit the nail on the head, because I actually think what's worse for them, much worse for them to come back, and what's worse than coming back and hearing people saying, well, I didn't support that war to begin with, what's worse is to come back and have nobody paying attention. I mean, that's actually worse. And, in a lot of ways, this book is about love, which kind of surprised me until I went back and really thought about it. And these people they love their country, and they want their country to love them back and to pay attention. So they do expect if they're wounded, they should be, treated well, and if that's for the rest of their life, that's what we owe them. I'll tell you the bigger thing, though, that I heard from them over and over and over again is that they want to feel like they can look over their shoulders from Iraq back to America and see that we're serving in our own ways, that we're finding a way to make the country live up to its potential and honor them for what they're doing over there.
Totally well agreed and well said, as a matter of fact. And as you said, too, you felt that your book was about love. Now, let's go ahead and talk about that as we're kind of getting close to the time that I know you need to move on to another show here. But what I got a kick out of is all the marriages that happened after the graduation at West Point. And you just wrote it in such a way it just seems so cute. Now, let's talk about that real briefly.
Yeah, sure. No, it's... I mean, they get married quickly. It really is amazing, and he got a West Point right after graduation, and they got the wedding ceremonies lined up one after the other in the chapel, and all that summer there are all these 22-year-old men and women all getting married, which is it's a young age for this day and age, and it's funny. I mean, on the one hand, it's because I suspect it's because they just came from a society that values honor and commitment and respect. But it's also this sort of, it's Army regulations. I mean, you graduate from West Point and you're going to go to a military base in Kansas or something. It kind of puts that pressure on that if you want that girl to stick with you better get a ring,
Absolutely. Now, now some of them actually, had left their wives behind, and then they also had children as well, and there were cases I know through the book that they were actually able to return. But what was it like for the survivors of the ones that you said had been killed in the war in Iraq?
Hard. I mean, very hard. I mean, as you might expect, but the tragedy of anyone who loses a loved one, but I think compounded in a few ways, especially early on in this war, because they felt alone. They felt that we're roughly 4,000, a little over 4,000 casualties in the war in Iraq now, but some of these were early on, and they didn't have peers. There weren't a lot of 23-year-old war widows in 2003, 2004, and I think also that I don't know what's worse, to have something come out of the blue or to be dreading it and expecting it day after day. But they had the latter in many of these cases, where they were worried every single day, and then their worst fears came true. So it was very hard for some of them. And even where people didn't die, the separation is difficult. I think it's something that maybe political leaders don't have an opportunity to take into consideration as much as they should. But just to be separated for 12 or 15 months, and an interesting thing, it's sometimes the wife who's gone and the husband who's back here, and that's interesting challenges as well that I had an opportunity to write about. So these people have sacrificed a lot and they've carried a lot, and what they do, what's the bottom line? They served, and I think we owe them a debt of gratitude.
Well, I think we actually owe them a lot more than that, because it's easy to sit back for an American public to say, well, I agree or disagree with the war. I don't want all your opinions about that, but in the meantime, what needs to be honored and nurtured are, just as we've been talking about, the soldiers who served over there, and also the families who support those soldiers who served, because, as you were just mentioning here real quickly, is the fact that that's also a casualty of war, I think, that a lot of us just don't understand or even just notice.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, when I go around and talk about this book, I wind up talking about national service, because people, I find by and large, people want to do something concrete to support these people, and when I say that what they want us to do is to find a way to improve our country, they want to do something themselves. Sometimes they already are, and it's just we don't recognize it under the rubric, the umbrella of national service. But so we're working with a bunch of different groups to try and create some sort of umbrella organization that reflects these things and encourages people and says, if you only have 10 hours to dedicate, well, here are some things you can do. And if people go to our website for the book, which is inatimeofwar.com, actually you'll see our contact information there. And if you're interested in helping us get this off the ground, we'd love to hear from you. And as long as I'm talking about the website, inatimeofwar.com, you'll see that we also have the first chapter of the book and a video. They did such a great job with this video, 3 minutes, that'll just introduce you to the characters and the tone of the book. So a lot in that little hiccup there, but again, this is what we're trying to do. And if you go to that website and contact us, we'd love to have your help.
Well, I certainly appreciate you, Bill Murphy, for putting out a book like this in a time of war. So again, we put the humanity back to the numbers, and then that way we understand, as you talk about, what it means to be a public servant, to be able to help serve these people who have served us. And again, I applaud you again for putting this out. Very unique story, very compelling. And Bill Murphy, we'd like to thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Thank you, Dan. It's been my pleasure.
You bet. Thank you. Again, the book is In a Time of War, The Proud and Perilous Journey of West Point's Class of 2002. And as Bill Murphy said, just simply click onto his website at inatimeofwar.com and find out about this marvelous set of stories that he wrote about West Point's graduating class of 2002. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in today. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit our website at beyond50radio.com with the number 50 with a 50 and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, live your day past halfway.